In the marble corridors of Ravencrest Palace, where every smile hides a secret and every whisper carries the weight of a kingdom, Prince Alexander discovered that his greatest enemy wasn't a foreign army or rebellious nobles. It was the woman his father had chosen to be his new mother. What began as family dinners and public ceremonies would soon become a deadly game of chess, where one wrong move could cost him everything he was born to inherit. The autumn rain drummed against the tall windows of Ravencrest Palace as Prince Alexander Sterling stood in the shadows of the grand staircase, watching his stepmother glide through the marble foyer below. Lady Vivian Blackthorne, now Queen Vivian, moved with the calculated grace of someone who had spent years perfecting every gesture, every expression, every carefully timed pause in conversation. Alexander's jaw tightened as he observed her interact with the palace staff. 6 months had passed since his father, King Edmund, had announced his marriage to the ambitious widow, and in those 6 months, Alexander had watched his position in the royal hierarchy slowly but systematically eroded. "Your Highness," came a soft voice behind him. Alexander turned to see his longtime friend and advisor, Marcus Hartwell, approaching with his usual cautious demeanor. "The king requests your presence in the throne room." Alexander nodded, straightening his shoulders as he prepared to face whatever new challenge awaited him. As they walked through the ornate corridors, Marcus leaned closer and spoke in hushed tones. "I've been hearing things, Alex. The Queen has been having private meetings with several members of Parliament. Lord Pemberton, Sir Reginald Ashworth, even young Countess Melbourne." "What kind of meetings?" Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The kind where your name comes up frequently, but not in ways that would please you." They paused outside the massive oak doors of the throne room. Alexander could hear voices inside, his father's deep baritone and Vivian's melodic soprano, punctuated by occasional laughter that sounded forced even through the thick wood. "She's building alliances," Alexander murmured, more to himself than to Marcus, "creating a network of supporters who owe their positions to her influence." "It's more than that," Marcus replied, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Yesterday, I overheard a conversation between 2 of the kitchen staff. Apparently, the Queen has been asking detailed questions about the palace's financial records, particularly the trust funds and inheritance structures." Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather. The royal inheritance laws of Aldoria were complex, dating back centuries, with various provisions that could be interpreted in different ways depending on who held influence over the interpretation. The throne room doors opened, and a palace attendant gestured for them to enter. King Edmund sat on the ancient throne, his once powerful frame showing the wear of his 68 years. Beside him, Queen Vivian occupied the smaller throne that had been hastily installed after their wedding, her emerald dress complementing the golden accents of the room perfectly. "Alexander, my boy," King Edmund called out, his voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine despite the circumstances. "Come, join us. We were just discussing the upcoming Harvest Festival celebrations." As Alexander approached, he noticed several documents spread across a small table between the thrones. From his angle, he could make out what appeared to be legal papers and correspondence bearing various official seals. "Your Majesty," Alexander said, bowing formally to both his father and stepmother. "I understand you wish to see me?" "Indeed," Vivian interjected before the king could respond, her voice carrying a subtle authority that would have been unthinkable just months ago. "We've been reviewing the festival arrangements, and it occurred to us that this would be an excellent opportunity for you to demonstrate your commitment to the people of Aldoria." Alexander's eyes narrowed slightly. In royal speak, demonstrate commitment usually meant prove yourself worthy, or more ominously, justify your position. King Edmund shifted in his throne, looking suddenly uncomfortable. "The Queen has suggested that you might take charge of the festival's charitable component this year. Organize the food distribution, coordinate with local merchants, that sort of thing." The insult was subtle, but unmistakable. The charitable component of the Harvest Festival was traditionally handled by junior members of the royal family or court officials, not the heir to the throne. Alexander's role in previous years had been to give the opening address, lead the ceremonial first dance, and host the diplomatic reception for foreign dignitaries. "Of course," Alexander replied smoothly, betraying none of his anger. "I would be honored to serve the people in whatever capacity you deem appropriate." Vivian's smile was radiant, but Alexander caught the brief flash of satisfaction in her eyes. "Wonderful. I've already taken the liberty of speaking with Lady Margaret Thornfield about coordinating the event. She'll be your primary liaison." Lady Margaret Thornfield, one of Vivian's closest allies, and a woman known throughout the court for her ability to make even the simplest tasks impossibly complicated. Another calculated move in what was becoming an increasingly obvious campaign to undermine his authority. "I'm sure Lady Thornfield and I will work well together," Alexander said, his tone betraying nothing of his growing realization that he was fighting for much more than a festival assignment. As the meeting concluded and he prepared to leave, Vivian called out one final comment that made his blood run cold. "Oh, Alexander, I nearly forgot. Your father and I have been discussing some potential updates to the succession protocols. Nothing urgent, of course, but the legal advisors thought it would be wise to review the documents and ensure everything is properly modernized for the 21st century." The words hung in the air like a sword suspended by a thread. Succession protocols weren't typically modernized unless someone was planning significant changes to who would inherit what. And when, later that evening, Alexander found himself in his private study, a room that had once belonged to his grandfather and still smelled faintly of tobacco and leather-bound books. Marcus sat across from him, both men nursing glasses of whiskey as they processed the day's events. "She's moving faster than I anticipated," Alexander admitted, staring into the amber liquid. 6 months ago, she was simply father's new wife. Now she's actively reshaping the court, influencing policy, and apparently reviewing succession laws. "The question is," Marcus said carefully, "what exactly is she trying to achieve? If she's hoping to position a future child as heir, the legal hurdles would be enormous. You're the legitimate firstborn son, and the succession laws are quite clear about that." Alexander set down his glass and moved to the window, looking out over the palace gardens where he had played as a child. "Unless she finds a way to prove I'm unfit to rule. Think about it. Marcus, every move she's made has been designed to put me in positions where I could fail publicly. The festival assignment isn't just an insult. It's an opportunity for her allies to document every mistake, every moment of perceived weakness. You think she's building a case against you? I think she's building multiple cases, pursuing multiple strategies simultaneously. She's too intelligent to rely on a single approach." Alexander turned back to his friend. "Which means we need to be equally strategic in our response." Marcus leaned forward, his expression growing serious. "What did you have in mind?" Alexander moved to his grandfather's old desk and pulled out a piece of stationery. "If Queen Vivian wants to play games, then we'll play games. But we'll play them better than she does." "That sounds dangerous, Alex. Your father loves her, and any direct confrontation could backfire spectacularly." "Which is why we won't confront her directly," Alexander replied, beginning to write. "We'll do exactly what she's doing, build alliances, create opportunities, and ensure that when the time comes to make crucial decisions, the right people are in position to influence those decisions in our favor." The first letter was addressed to Colonel James Weatherby, the head of the Royal Guard, and a man who had served Alexander's grandfather with unwavering loyalty. The second went to Dame Elizabeth Cromwell, the palace's head of household staff, whose network of information rivaled any intelligence service. The third was for Lord Christopher Ashford, Alexander's godfather and one of the most influential members of Parliament. As he wrote, Alexander felt a strange mixture of sadness and determination. He had never wanted to engage in palace intrigue, preferring straightforward honesty to manipulation and schemes. But Vivian had made the choice for him, and now he had to adapt or risk losing everything his family had built over generations. "There's something else," Marcus said quietly. "I've been doing some research into Queen Vivian's background, try to understand her methods. Her first husband, Lord Blackthorn, died under somewhat mysterious circumstances. Alexander's pen paused mid-sentence. What kind of mysterious circumstances? Officially, it was a heart attack brought on by stress from financial difficulties. But several people I've spoken with remember that Lord Blackthorn was in excellent health and had recently inherited a substantial sum from a distant relative. The financial difficulties appeared quite suddenly, just weeks before his death. And after he died, Lady Vivian inherited everything, paid off the mysterious debts, and emerged as one of the wealthiest widows in the kingdom. Wealthy enough to catch the attention of a lonely king looking for companionship after years of mourning his beloved first wife. Alexander felt the pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to take shape in his mind. If Vivian had somehow orchestrated her first husband's downfall and death, then her campaign against him represented far more than simple ambition. It was a pattern of behavior that suggested she was willing to destroy anyone who stood between her and power. "Marcus," he said, his voice taking on a new edge of urgency, "I need you to expand your research. Find out everything you can about Lord Blackthorn's death, about Vivian's activities during that period, about anyone who might have helped her or who might have knowledge of what really happened. That could take weeks, possibly months. Then we'd better start tonight." Alexander sealed the 3 letters and handed them to his friend. "Have these delivered first thing in the morning, but use discreet couriers, people we trust completely." As Marcus prepared to leave, Alexander called out one final instruction. "And Marcus? From now on, we assume that every conversation could be overheard, every letter could be intercepted, and every ally could potentially be compromised. If Queen Vivian taught me anything today, it's that in this game, paranoia isn't a weakness, it's a survival skill." After Marcus departed, Alexander stood alone in his study, surrounded by centuries of royal history. Portraits of his ancestors gazed down at him from the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge his readiness for the battle that lay ahead. He thought about his mother, Queen Isabella, who had died when he was 16. She had been beloved by the people, respected by Parliament, and utterly devoted to the principles of fair and just rule. She had also been completely unprepared for the kind of ruthless political maneuvering that Vivian employed so effortlessly. But Alexander wasn't his mother, and he wasn't his father. He was a product of both their strengths and their weaknesses, shaped by years of observing court politics and international diplomacy. If Vivian wanted to test his fitness to rule, then perhaps it was time to show her, and everyone else, exactly what kind of king he intended to become. The rain had stopped, and moonlight now streamed through the study windows, casting long shadows across the room. Somewhere in the palace, Queen Vivian was probably planning her next move, confident in her ability to outmaneuver a young prince who she assumed was unprepared for real conflict. She was about to discover just how wrong that assumption was 3 weeks after that pivotal night in his study. Prince Alexander found himself standing in the early morning mist of the palace gardens, meeting with Colonel James Weatherby. The older man had responded to Alexander's letter with characteristic military efficiency, and their clandestine meetings had become a regular occurrence as Alexander began building his network of loyal allies. "Your Highness," Colonel Weatherby said, his weathered face grave with concern, "I've completed the security assessment you requested. What I've discovered is troubling." Alexander gestured for them to walk along the secluded path that wound through his grandmother's rose garden, a place where the sound of a nearby fountain would mask their conversation from any potential eavesdroppers. "Tell me," Alexander said simply. "The Queen has been making subtle but significant changes to palace security protocols. Nothing dramatic enough to raise official concerns, but when taken together, the pattern is unmistakable." Colonel Weatherby pulled a small notebook from his jacket. "She's requested additional guards for her personal quarters, citing concerns about her safety. She's also suggested modifications to the existing shift schedules that would place her most trusted guards in key positions during nighttime hours. Key positions such as the entrances to the royal family's private wing, the communications center, and, most significantly, the approaches to your father's chambers." The colonel's voice lowered. Your Highness, if someone wanted to control access to the king during his most vulnerable hours, these changes would accomplish exactly that. Alexander felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. What about the guards themselves? Do we know where their loyalties lie? That's where the situation becomes even more concerning. 3 of the new guards that the Queen specifically requested are men with questionable backgrounds. Not criminals, mind you, but individuals who've had financial difficulties, family problems, or other circumstances that might make them susceptible to influence. They paused beside an ornate bench where Alexander's mother used to sit and read in the afternoons. The memory strengthened his resolve to protect what she had loved so deeply. Colonel, I need you to maintain detailed records of these changes, but don't attempt to block them directly. If we oppose her too obviously, she'll simply find other methods. Instead, I want you to quietly ensure that our own loyal guards are strategically positioned to observe and report on any unusual activities. Understood, Your Highness. And what are the king's personal security detail? Leave that to me. I've been working on that particular problem through other channels. As they concluded their meeting, Alexander's mind was already turning to his next appointment. Dame Elizabeth Cromwell had requested an urgent meeting, and her message had carried an undertone of alarm that Alexander had never seen from the usually unflappable head of household staff. An hour later, Alexander sat in Dame Elizabeth's private office, a cozy room tucked away in the administrative wing of the palace. The elderly woman, who had overseen the royal household for nearly 3 decades, poured tea with hands that trembled slightly, a detail that immediately caught Alexander's attention. Your Highness, she began without preamble, I've served this palace since before you were born, and I've never felt the need to involve myself in political matters. But what's happening now goes beyond politics. It threatens the very foundation of everything we've worked to preserve. Alexander leaned forward, recognizing the gravity in her voice. Dame Elizabeth had weathered royal scandals, international crises, and family tragedies with unshakable composure. If something had rattled her, it was serious indeed. Tell me what you've discovered. The Queen has been conducting what she calls efficiency reviews of the household staff. On the surface, it appears to be standard administrative work, reviewing job descriptions, updating protocols, that sort of thing. But in reality, she's been systematically identifying staff members who have long-time loyalties to your family and finding reasons to transfer them, demote them, or encourage their retirement. Dame Elizabeth reached in her desk drawer and withdrew a thick folder. These are the personnel files of 18 staff members who have been targeted over the past 2 months. Look at the pattern, Your Highness. Alexander reviewed the documents, his expression growing darker with each page. The affected employees included his mother's former ladies-in-waiting, guards who had served during his grandfather's reign, kitchen staff who prepared his childhood meals, and groundskeepers who had taught him to ride his first pony. She's removing your support network, Dame Elizabeth continued. But more than that, she's replacing these loyal staff members with people who owe their positions entirely to her. People who will report to her first and ask questions later. What's her stated justification for these changes? Modernization and cost reduction. She's convinced your father that the palace has become inefficient, that we're carrying too many employees who are set in old ways and resistant to change. She presents detailed financial analyses showing potential savings, efficiency improvements, all very professional and reasonable sounding. Alexander set down the files and looked directly at Dame Elizabeth. But you don't believe that's her real motivation. Your Highness, I've been managing household staff for 30 years. I know the difference between genuine efficiency improvements and a systematic purge. This woman is rebuilding the palace staff from the ground up, creating a network of employees who are personally indebted to her and who will prioritize her interests over traditional protocols. The implications were staggering. If Vivian controlled the household staff, she would have unprecedented access to information about the royal family's daily activities, private conversations, correspondence, and personal habits. She would know Alexander's schedule before he did, would be aware of his meetings and alliances, and would have advance warning of any actions he might take against her. Dame Elizabeth, I need you to document everything you've told me, but keep those records secure and separate from the official palace files. Can you also provide me with a list of staff members who you believe remain loyal to my family? Of course, Your Highness. But I must warn you, the list is shorter than it was a month ago, and it's getting shorter every week. As Alexander left Dame Elizabeth's office, he reflected on how completely he had underestimated his stepmother's strategic capabilities. She wasn't simply positioning herself for future power. She was systematically dismantling the existing power structure and replacing it with one that served her interests exclusively. His next stop was the palace library, where he had arranged to meet with Dr. Reginald Pemberton, the palace historian and one of the few people who possess complete knowledge of Eldoria's succession laws and royal protocols. Alexander found the elderly scholar in the archive room, surrounded by ancient legal documents and constitutional texts. Your Highness, Dr. Pemberton said, rising from his desk with obvious relief. Thank you for meeting with me. I've been researching the matters you inquired about, and I'm afraid my findings are quite disturbing. Alexander settled into a chair across from the historian's desk, noting the numerous books and documents that had been pulled from the archives. What have you discovered? I've been reviewing the succession laws, particularly focusing on provisions that might allow for changes to the established inheritance order. While the laws are generally quite clear about the rights of legitimate heirs, there are several historical precedents that could potentially be invoked under specific circumstances. Dr. Pemberton opened one of the ancient texts and pointed to a passage written in elegant script. This provision, dating back to the reign of King Edward III, allows for the displacement of an heir if that heir is deemed unfit for rule by reason of moral failings, incompetence, or actions contrary to the welfare of the realm. What would constitute proof of such unfitness? That's where the situation becomes particularly complex. The determination of unfitness requires a formal review by a council consisting of senior nobles, religious leaders, and parliamentary representatives. However, the criteria for unfitness are deliberately vague, allowing for significant interpretation based on the political climate and the influence of those conducting the review. Alexander felt a growing sense of unease as the pieces of Vivian's strategy became clearer. And who would appoint the members of such a council? In consultation with Parliament, the reigning monarch would have significant influence over the composition of the review council. If your father were to become convinced that such a review was necessary, he would naturally turn to his most trusted advisors for guidance on who should conduct it, Alexander finished. Advisors who increasingly include Queen Vivian and the allies she's been cultivating. Dr. Pemberton nodded gravely. Your Highness, there's more. I've also discovered records of similar succession challenges from other European monarchies. In several cases, ambitious stepmothers or second wives successfully orchestrated the displacement of rightful heirs through carefully orchestrated campaigns of character assassination and political manipulation. Show me. For the next hour, Dr. Pemberton walked Alexander through historical case studies that read like a blueprint for Vivian's current activities. The patterns were remarkably consistent. Isolate the heir from loyal supporters, create situations where the heir could be perceived as failing in their duties, build a coalition of nobles and officials who benefit from supporting the challenge, and, finally, present the monarch with what appears to be overwhelming evidence of the heir's unfitness. In most successful cases, Dr. Pemberton explained, the displaced heir never saw the final blow coming until it was too late. The campaigns were conducted so subtly that the heirs often believed they were simply experiencing a run of bad luck or facing normal political challenges. Alexander thought about his recent experiences, the festival assignment, the security changes, the staff replacements, the legal reviews. Each incident had seemed relatively minor in isolation, but viewed as part of a coordinated campaign, they revealed a level of strategic planning that was both impressive and terrifying. Dr. Pemberton, I need you to prepare a comprehensive analysis of our succession laws, including all potential challenges and the legal requirements for defending against them. Can you also research Queen Vivian's family history, particularly any connections to other royal courts or nobility who might have experience with succession disputes. Certainly, Your Highness. But may I ask what you intend to do with this information? Alexander stood and moved to the library window, looking out over the courtyard where he could see Vivian walking with several members of Parliament. She was animated in conversation, gesturing elegantly as she made some point that had her companions nodding in apparent agreement. I intend to ensure that when Queen Vivian makes her final move, she discovers that I've been several steps ahead of her all along. That evening, Alexander hosted a private dinner in his chambers for Lord Christopher Ashford, his godfather, and one of the most influential members of Parliament. Lord Ashford had been a close friend of Alexander's mother, and had watched the young prince grow up with the keen eye of someone who understood both politics and human nature. Alexander, Lord Ashford said as they settled into comfortable chairs after the meal, I received your letter, and I must say, your concerns about Queen Vivian's activities align with some troubling observations I've made in Parliament. What kind of observations? She's been cultivating relationships with several key parliamentary figures, particularly those who chair important committees related to royal affairs, constitutional law, and public finances. Her approach is quite sophisticated. She doesn't directly discuss political matters, but instead focuses on cultural events, charitable initiatives, and social connections. Lord Ashford paused to sip his wine before continuing. However, I've noticed that these social interactions invariably lead to discussions about the future of the monarchy, the need for fresh perspectives in royal leadership, and subtle criticisms of what she characterizes as outdated approaches to governance. Is she building support for a specific agenda? Not explicitly, but the groundwork is certainly being laid. She's positioning herself as a modernizing influence, while subtly suggesting that the traditional approaches favored by your family may be inadequate for contemporary challenges. Alexander shared the information he had gathered from Colonel Weatherby, Dame Elizabeth, and Dr. Pemberton, watching as his godfather's expression grew increasingly serious. Alexander, Lord Ashford said finally, what you're describing is a comprehensive campaign to undermine your position and create the conditions for a succession challenge. The sophistication and coordination involved suggest that Queen Vivian has significant experience with this type of political maneuvering. Which brings me to something Marcus has been investigating. Alexander briefly outlined his friend's research into Lord Blackthorn's mysterious death and Vivian's convenient inheritance. Lord Ashford was quiet for several minutes, his legal mind processing the implications. If your suspicions about Lord Blackthorn's death are correct, then Queen Vivian isn't simply an ambitious stepmother. She's someone who has potentially committed murder to achieve her goals. That changes everything about how we need to approach this situation. What do you recommend? We need irrefutable evidence before we can make any direct accusations. But in the meantime, we need to accelerate your defensive strategy. Queen Vivian has been building her network for months while you've been unaware of the threat. We need to catch up quickly. Lord Ashford pulled out a small notebook and began writing. I'm going to arrange for you to meet with several key parliamentary allies, but we'll do it through social events and unofficial gatherings. We'll also need to identify nobles and court officials who might be wavering in their loyalties and work to secure their support. What about my father? Should we consider approaching him directly? Not yet. From what you've described, King Edmund genuinely cares for Queen Vivian, and any direct challenge to her could backfire catastrophically. Instead, we need to demonstrate your fitness for rule through actions rather than accusations. They spent the rest of the evening planning a counter-campaign that would showcase Alexander's leadership capabilities while building a network of supporters who could defend against any future succession challenge. The strategy was complex and would require careful coordination, but for the first time since discovering Vivian's true intentions, Alexander felt like he had a realistic path forward. As Lord Ashford prepared to leave, he offered one final piece of advice that would prove prophetic in the weeks to come. Alexander, remember that Queen Vivian's greatest strength is also her greatest weakness. She's so focused on manipulating others that she may not realize when she's being manipulated in return. If we're clever about it, we can use her own tactics against her. Later that night, As Alexander reviewed his notes and planned his next moves, he received an unexpected visitor. A soft knock on his door revealed Marcus, who entered looking both excited and concerned. "Alex, I made a breakthrough in my research about Lord Blackthorn's death, but what I've discovered is going to change everything we thought we knew about Queen Vivian's background." Alexander gestured for his friend to sit, pouring 2 glasses of whiskey as he prepared to hear what might be the most crucial piece of information in their developing strategy. "What did you find?" Marcus opened a folder filled with documents, photographs, and correspondence. Lady Vivian Blackthorn isn't who she claims to be. Her real name is Vivian Moreau, and she's the daughter of a French nobleman who lost his fortune in a series of failed investments. More importantly, she's been married not once, but 3 times, and all 3 of her previous husbands died under suspicious circumstances, leaving her substantially wealthier each time. The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. If Marcus was correct, then Vivian wasn't simply an ambitious stepmother or even a murderous widow. She was a serial killer who had perfected the art of marrying wealthy men and eliminating them when they were no longer useful. And now she was married to his father. The morning after Marcus's shocking revelation, Alexander found himself pacing the length of his private study, his mind racing with the implications of what they had discovered. Vivian Moreau, serial killer, master manipulator, and now Queen of Valdoria, represented a threat that went far beyond his own succession rights. His father's life was quite literally in danger. Marcus sat at the desk, surrounded by documents they had spent the night reviewing. Birth certificates, marriage records, death certificates, financial documents, and witness statements painted a picture of a woman who had systematically destroyed 3 lives while building her own fortune and social position. Her first husband was Henri Dubois, a wine merchant from Bordeaux. Marcus explained, his voice hoarse from hours of discussion. Married when she was 19, widowed at 22. Official cause of death was a riding accident, but several witnesses noted that Henri was an excellent horseman who had been riding the same trails for decades. After his death, Vivian inherited his vineyards and a substantial sum of money. Alexander paused in his pacing to examine a photograph of a young Vivian standing beside a handsome man in riding attire. Even then, her smile had carried that calculated quality he had learned to recognize. Her second husband was Lord Richard Pemberton, an English nobleman she met while selling her late husband's wine business. Marcus continued. They were married for 3 years before he died of what was diagnosed as food poisoning during a dinner party at their estate. Vivian was, conveniently, visiting her sister in Paris when it happened. And she inherited again everything. Lord Pemberton's estate, his investments, and his connections to English high society, which led her to Lord Blackthorn, whom she married 2 years later. Alexander studied the documentation Marcus had gathered. Bank records showed a pattern of financial transfers in the months leading up to each husband's death, always moving money to accounts that Vivian controlled exclusively. Insurance policies had been increased shortly before each death. And in all 3 cases, Vivian had alibis that were just slightly too convenient to be believable. How did you uncover all of this? I started with Lord Blackthorn's death and worked backward. Once I found inconsistencies in that case, I began looking for similar patterns. It took weeks of research in French and English archives, plus some unofficial assistance from contacts in various government offices. Marcus pulled out a final document that made Alexander's blood run cold. This is what convinced me we're dealing with someone truly dangerous. I found a private investigator's report commissioned by Lord Blackthorn's brother just weeks before Blackthorn's death. He had become suspicious of his sister-in-law's behavior and hired someone to look into her background. What did the investigator discover? Enough to conclude that Lord Blackthorn was in serious danger. The report recommended immediate legal action to protect Blackthorn's assets and suggested involving law enforcement. But the investigator died in a carriage accident before he could present his findings, and the report was buried in legal files until I found it. Alexander felt a chill as he realized how close they might be to sharing the investigator's fate. If Vivian had killed to protect her secrets before, she wouldn't hesitate to do so again. Marcus, from this moment forward, we assume that our lives are in danger. We need to take precautions to protect ourselves, but more importantly, we need to protect my father without alerting Vivian to what we've discovered. They spent the morning developing a strategy that balanced the urgent need to warn King Edmund with the equally pressing need to avoid triggering Vivian into precipitous action. The plan they settled on was complex and risky, but it offered their best chance of saving the king while building a case against his murderous wife. Alexander's first move was to arrange a private meeting with Dr. Hammond, the royal physician who had served the family for over 20 years. If Vivian intended to harm the king, she would likely use methods that appeared natural, and Dr. Hammond's cooperation would be essential for detecting and preventing such attempts. The meeting took place in Dr. Hammond's private office in the palace medical wing, away from the areas where Vivian's newly placed staff might overhear their conversation. "Your Highness," Dr. Hammond said, his weathered face showing concern, "your message indicated a matter of extreme urgency regarding the king's health." Alexander had prepared carefully for this conversation, knowing that what he was about to reveal would sound almost incredible to someone who hadn't seen the evidence Marcus had assembled. "Dr. Hammond, I'm about to share information with you that will be shocking and potentially dangerous. But I need your word that you'll hear me out completely before making any judgments." The physician nodded, his professional demeanor sharpening as he recognized the gravity in Alexander's voice. Alexander began with Vivian's behavior in the palace, the systematic changes to security, staff, and protocols, before moving to the historical evidence of her previous marriages and the suspicious deaths of her former husbands. Dr. Hammond's expression grew increasingly alarmed as Alexander presented Marcus's documentation. "Your Highness," Dr. Hammond said finally, "if what you're telling me is accurate, then King Edmund is in immediate danger. But more than that, we may have been witnessing the early stages of her campaign against him already." "What do you mean?" "Over the past month, His Majesty has been complaining of occasional fatigue, minor digestive issues, and difficulty sleeping. I attributed these symptoms to the normal effects of age and the stress of his royal duties. But in light of what you've just told me, you think she's already begun poisoning him?" "It's possible. The symptoms could indicate low-level, chronic poisoning designed to gradually weaken his system without causing immediate alarm. It's a method that would allow her to maintain the appearance of a devoted wife while slowly killing her husband." Alexander felt a surge of rage and fear that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. The thought that Vivian might already be murdering his father was almost unbearable. "Dr. Hammond, I need you to begin monitoring my father's health much more closely. Can you conduct tests that might detect poisoning without alerting Queen Vivian to your suspicions?" "Yes, but it will require careful coordination. I'll need to arrange for comprehensive health assessments under the guise of routine preventive care. I can also begin subtle inquiries about his diet and any new medications or supplements the Queen might have introduced." They agreed on a monitoring protocol that would allow Dr. Hammond to track the king's health while gathering evidence of any poisoning attempts. Alexander also arranged for the physician to communicate any concerns through Colonel Weatherby, creating a secure information channel that bypassed Vivian's growing network of informants. Alexander's next priority was accelerating his alliance-building efforts while simultaneously gathering more evidence of Vivian's crimes. Lord Christopher Ashford had arranged a series of social gatherings that would allow Alexander to meet with key political figures without arousing suspicion, and these meetings proved crucial in building support for his position. The first event was a hunting party at Lord Ashford's estate, attended by several influential members of Parliament and senior nobles. As they rode through the countryside, Alexander found opportunities for private conversations with potential allies, carefully gauging their loyalty and their concerns about the current political situation. Lord William Harrington, the chairman of the Parliamentary Committee on Royal Affairs, proved particularly receptive to Alexander's subtle inquiries about succession law and constitutional stability. "Your Highness," Lord Harrington said as they paused to water their horses beside a stream, I must confess that I've been somewhat concerned about certain recent developments in the court. There have been rumors of significant changes to traditional protocols and procedures. Alexander recognized the opening and responded carefully. I share those concerns, Lord Harrington. I believe it's crucial that any changes to royal traditions be made thoughtfully and with proper consideration for their long-term implications. Indeed. And I hope you know that you have the support of many in Parliament who value stability and continuity in our constitutional monarchy. Similar conversations took place throughout the day, and by evening, Alexander had secured commitments of support from 5 key political figures who would be crucial if Vivian attempted to challenge his succession. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his investigation into Vivian's background, focusing on identifying any living witnesses or evidence that might be used in a criminal case against her. His breakthrough came through an unexpected source, a retired servant who had worked in Lord Blackthorn's household during Vivian's marriage to him. Her name is Mrs. Adelaide Fletcher, Marcus reported during one of their evening meetings. She worked as Lord Blackthorn's housekeeper for 15 years, including the entire period of his marriage to Vivian. She's been living quietly in a cottage in Cornwall, but she agreed to speak with me after I explained that her former employer's death might not have been natural. What did she tell you? Enough to confirm our worst suspicions. Mrs. Fletcher noticed that Lord Blackthorn's health began declining shortly after Vivian took over management of the household meals. She also observed Vivian administering what she claimed were vitamin supplements and herbal remedies, always insisting that she prepare them personally. Marcus opened his notebook to review his interview notes. More significantly, Mrs. Fletcher witnessed Vivian disposing of bottles and containers late at night, always burning them in the estate's furnace. When she asked about it, Vivian claimed she was simply being careful about household waste, but Mrs. Fletcher found the behavior suspicious. Would she be willing to testify about what she observed? She's frightened, but yes. She said she's carried guilt about Lord Blackthorn's death for years, wondering if she should have done something to protect him. The evidence was building, but Alexander knew that accusations against the Queen would require absolutely irrefutable proof. They needed to catch Vivian in the act of attempting to harm King Edmund, while ensuring that they could protect the king from any immediate danger. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Dr. Hammond sent word through Colonel Weatherby that the king's health had taken a sudden turn for the worse, with symptoms that strongly suggested acute poisoning. More importantly, Vivian had insisted on personally preparing his evening medications, claiming that she wanted to ensure he received the best possible care. Alexander realized that this might be their only chance to gather the evidence they needed while potentially saving his father's life. Working with Dr. Hammond and Colonel Weatherby, they developed a plan to catch Vivian in the act while protecting the king from her murderous intentions. The plan was set in motion that very evening. Dr. Hammond would visit the king for a routine checkup, during which he would discreetly substitute harmless placebos for whatever medications Vivian intended to administer. Colonel Weatherby would position trusted guards to observe and document Vivian's activities, and Alexander would ensure that independent witnesses were present to verify whatever they discovered. As the evening unfolded, Alexander waited in his study with Marcus and Lord Ashford, all of them understanding that the next few hours would determine not only the fate of King Edmund, but the future of the Valdorian monarchy itself. The first message came from Dr. Hammond. The king's evening medication had been replaced with harmless substitutes, and blood samples had been taken for analysis. The second message from Colonel Weatherby was more ominous. Queen Vivian had been observed in the palace kitchens late that evening, preparing something in a small pot over a private burner, working alone, and disposing of materials in a way that suggested she didn't want anyone to see what she was doing. The final message arrived near midnight, and its contents confirmed their worst fears while providing the evidence they needed to act. Dr. Hammond's analysis of the medications Vivian had prepared for the king showed lethal concentrations of digitalis, a plant-based poison that would cause heart failure while appearing to be a natural cardiac event. Alexander felt a mixture of relief that they had prevented his father's murder and cold fury at the woman who had systematically planned to destroy his family. But the evidence they had gathered presented him with a terrible choice: how to expose Vivian's crimes without creating a scandal that could destroy the monarchy itself. The solution came from an unexpected source. As Alexander, Marcus, and Lord Ashford debated their options, a messenger arrived with urgent news that would change everything. Queen Vivian had collapsed in her chambers and was apparently near death, apparently the victim of the very poison she had intended for the king. Racing to Vivian's chambers with Dr. Hammond, Alexander found his stepmother conscious, but clearly dying, surrounded by evidence of her crimes that she had apparently been preparing to destroy. In her final moments, perhaps seeking some form of redemption or simply wanting to unburden herself, Vivian confessed to the murders of her 3 previous husbands and her intended murder of King Edmund. Dr. Hammond documented her confession, while Colonel Weatherby secured the physical evidence of her poisoning activities. Within hours, the immediate crisis was over, but the aftermath would require careful management to protect both the royal family and the stability of the kingdom. King Edmund, shocked by the revelation of his wife's true nature and grateful for his son's intervention, fully endorsed Alexander's actions and formally recognized him as his heir without reservation. The story presented to the public was carefully crafted to acknowledge Vivian's death without revealing the full extent of her crimes, protecting the monarchy's reputation while ensuring that justice was served. In the days that followed, Alexander reflected on how the crisis had fundamentally changed him. He had entered the conflict as a young prince focused primarily on protecting his inheritance, but had emerged as a leader who understood the true responsibilities of power and the lengths to which he would go to protect those he loved. The experience had also taught him valuable lessons about the nature of political maneuvering and the importance of building strong alliances based on mutual respect and shared values. The relationships he had forged during the crisis, with Colonel Weatherby, Dame Elizabeth, Dr. Hammond, Lord Ashford, and others, would serve as the foundation for his future reign. As he stood once again in his study, looking out over the palace gardens where this had all began, Alexander understood that his real education as a future king had not come from books or formal instruction, but from the crucible of genuine crisis. He had learned to think strategically, act decisively, and accept the terrible burdens that came with power and responsibility. The prince who had once worried primarily about protocol and ceremony had become a man capable of outmaneuvering a serial killer and saving his father's life. And as he prepared for the challenges that lay ahead, Alexander knew that no future crisis would find him unprepared for the realities of leadership in a world where the stakes were always life and death. The game was over, but the real work of becoming a king was just beginning. 6 months had passed since Queen Vivian's death, and the kingdom of Aldoria had begun to heal from the hidden wounds her presence had inflicted. Yet for Prince Alexander, the true challenges were only beginning to emerge as he discovered the full extent of the damage she had caused to the monarchy's foundations and worked to rebuild what she had systematically destroyed. The first indication that their victory over Vivian had been incomplete came during a routine meeting of the Royal Council. Lord Chancellor Pemberton, a man Alexander had previously considered completely loyal, made a subtle but unmistakable reference to concerns about the stability of the succession that several council members apparently shared. Alexander exchanged glances with Lord Ashford across the council table, both men recognizing the coded language that suggested some nobles were still questioning his fitness to rule. Despite having saved his father's life and exposed Vivian's crimes, Alexander realized that the seeds of doubt she had planted were still taking root in certain quarters. After the meeting, Alexander convened an emergency session with his core allies in the private chamber that had become their unofficial war room. Marcus had prepared detailed intelligence reports on the political climate, while Colonel Weatherby provided security assessments, and Dr. Hammond offered insights into the king's recovery from his near poisoning. The situation is more complex than we initially realized, Marcus began, spreading documents across the table. While Vivian is dead, her network of supporters and beneficiaries remains largely intact. Many of the people she placed in key positions still owe their advancement to her influence, and they're naturally concerned about their own futures under your eventual reign. Lord Ashford nodded gravely. More troubling is the fact that some nobles seem to believe that the entire crisis was manufactured by you as a way to eliminate competition for the throne. There are whispers that Vivian's death was too convenient, that her confession was coerced, and that you orchestrated the whole affair to secure your position. Alexander felt a familiar surge of frustration at the political realities he continued to face. Even with overwhelming evidence of Vivian's guilt, some people chose to believe conspiracy theories rather than accept the uncomfortable truth about how completely they had been deceived. "What's driving these theories?" he asked. "Several factors," Colonel Weatherby replied. "First, Duke Reginald Blackwood, whom Vivian had cultivated as a key ally, stands to lose significant influence under your future reign. He's been quietly promoting the idea that the evidence against Vivian was fabricated to remove her as an obstacle to your ambitions." Second, Dr. Hammond added, "Some members of Parliament who had developed working relationships with Vivian are concerned about their own political futures. They're encouraging questions about the official version of events as a way to maintain their relevance in the new political landscape." Marcus pulled out a folder filled with intercepted correspondence. "Most significantly, we've discovered that Vivian had been in communication with external parties who may have had their own interests in destabilizing Valdoria's monarchy. Foreign intelligence services, rival noble families from neighboring kingdoms, and financial interests that benefit from political uncertainty." The implications were staggering. Alexander had assumed that Vivian's death would end the threats against his family and his future reign, but instead it appeared that she had been part of a larger network of interests working to undermine Valdorian stability. "Are you saying that Vivian was working with foreign powers?" "We can't prove direct collaboration," Marcus replied carefully, "but the timing and nature of some of her activities suggest coordination with external parties. Her systematic weakening of palace security, her efforts to isolate you from loyal supporters, and her attempts to create succession uncertainty would all serve the interests of kingdoms that view Valdoria as a strategic competitor." Lord Ashford leaned forward, his expression troubled. "Alexander, I think we need to consider the possibility that removing Vivian was only the first phase of a much larger conflict. If she was indeed part of a coordinated campaign against your family's rule, then her death may have simply prompted her allies to accelerate their timeline." The meeting was interrupted by an urgent message from Dame Elizabeth Cromwell. The palace's head of household staff requested an immediate private audience with Alexander, citing developments that require immediate attention and absolute discretion. 20 minutes later, Alexander sat in Dame Elizabeth's office, watching the normally composed woman pace nervously as she prepared to deliver what was clearly disturbing news. "Your Highness, I've discovered something that changes our understanding of Queen Vivian's activities during her time in the palace. Something that suggests her network was far more extensive than we realized." She moved to her desk and opened a concealed compartment that Alexander had never noticed in all his years visiting her office. From it, she withdrew a leather portfolio containing documents, photographs, and what appeared to be coded correspondence. "Where did these come from?" Alexander asked. "I discovered them hidden in the Queen's former chambers during the final cleaning and renovation work. They were concealed behind a false panel in her private study, a hiding place so well constructed that we might never have found it if one of the renovation workers hadn't accidentally damaged the wall." Alexander examined the documents, immediately recognizing that they represented a level of organization and planning that went far beyond anything they had previously uncovered. The papers included detailed profiles of key political figures, financial records of payments made to various individuals, and correspondence with parties whose identities were hidden behind code names. "Dame Elizabeth, have you shared this discovery with anyone else?" "No, Your Highness. I brought everything directly to you, but I must confess that I'm concerned about the security implications of what these documents reveal." One particular document caught Alexander's attention, a letter dated just weeks before Vivian's death, apparently outlining a plan for Phase 2 implementation following the primary objective's completion. The language was cryptic, but the implication was clear. Vivian had been working toward multiple goals, and her attempt on King Edmund's life had been only one component of a larger strategy. Dame Elizabeth, I need you to secure these documents and ensure that no one else becomes aware of their existence until we can fully analyze their contents. Can you also provide me with a list of anyone who had access to the Queen's chambers during the renovation process? Of course, Your Highness. But I should warn you that at least a dozen different workers and staff members had access to those rooms over the past month. The possibility that news of the document's discovery might already be spreading through the palace added a new layer of urgency to Alexander's situation. If Vivian's remaining allies learned that additional evidence of their collaboration existed, they might take desperate action to protect themselves. Alexander spent the rest of the day working with Marcus to analyze the newly discovered documents, gradually piecing together a picture of a conspiracy that reached much higher levels of government and extended much further beyond Valdoria's borders than they had imagined. The coded correspondence revealed that Vivian had been reporting regularly to contacts in at least 3 neighboring kingdoms, providing them with detailed intelligence about Valdorian military capabilities, economic policies, and political vulnerabilities. More disturbing were the financial records showing payments made to various Valdorian nobles and officials, suggesting that she had built a network of paid informants and collaborators throughout the government. Alexander, Marcus said as they worked late into the evening, I think we're looking at evidence of a comprehensive intelligence operation designed to prepare for either a foreign invasion or an internal coup. The level of detail in these reports would give any hostile power enormous advantages in planning military or political action against Valdoria. But why would neighboring kingdoms want to destabilize our monarchy? Valdoria has maintained peaceful relations with our neighbors for generations. That's exactly the problem from their perspective. Valdoria's stability and prosperity make us a strategic competitor. Our trade relationships, our military alliances, and our diplomatic influence all represent obstacles to other kingdoms' ambitions for regional dominance. As they continued their analysis, a pattern emerged that made Alexander's blood run cold. The intelligence reports Vivian had been providing weren't simply general information about Valdorian capabilities. They were specifically focused on information that would be useful for planning targeted assassinations of key leaders, including detailed profiles of security arrangements, daily schedules, and personal vulnerabilities. Marcus, I think Vivian's attempt on my father's life wasn't the end of their plan. It was the beginning. They intended to eliminate the king, create a succession crisis with me facing challenges to my legitimacy, and then exploit the resulting chaos to achieve whatever their ultimate objective might be. Which means that even though Vivian is dead, the plan is probably still moving forward. Her death might have delayed the timeline, but if there are other operatives in place... Alexander's thoughts were interrupted by an urgent knock on his study door. Colonel Weatherby entered without waiting for permission, his face grim with concern. Your Highness, we have an immediate security situation. 3 members of the Royal Guard were found unconscious at their posts, apparently drugged. Someone has infiltrated the palace. The 3 men immediately understood that their investigation into Vivian's conspiracy had triggered a response from her remaining allies. Someone was taking action to either silence them or complete whatever mission Vivian had been unable to finish. Colonel, what's the status of the king's security? His Majesty is secure in his private chambers with a detail of our most trusted guards. But whoever is responsible for tonight's infiltration had detailed knowledge of our security protocols and guard rotation schedules. Alexander realized that they were facing exactly the kind of coordinated attack that Vivian's intelligence reports had been designed to facilitate. The enemy knew their defenses, understood their procedures, and had been planning this operation for months. We need to assume that the infiltrator's target is either my father or myself, possibly both. Colonel, can you implement emergency lockdown procedures while maintaining the appearance of normal operations? Already in progress, Your Highness. But there's another complication. We've lost communication with the guard posts covering the main approaches to the palace. Either our communication systems have been compromised, or those positions have been neutralized. The situation was escalating rapidly into exactly the kind of crisis that Vivian's network had been preparing for. Alexander realized that they were facing a coordinated attack that had been planned as the follow-up to his father's assassination, now apparently being implemented despite the change in circumstances. Marcus, I need you to secure all the documents we've discovered and prepare them for transmission to Lord Ashford and our other allies. If something happens to us tonight, they'll need this evidence to understand what they're really fighting against. Alexander, we should evacuate. Get you and the king to a secure location until we can understand the full scope of what's happening. No, if we run now, we'll simply be playing into their hands. They want chaos and uncertainty, and our evacuation would provide exactly that. Instead, we're going to end this tonight. Alexander moved to his desk and began writing rapidly, preparing messages that would activate every alliance and resource he had built over the past months. If Vivian's network wanted to implement their conspiracy, they would discover that the prince they had underestimated was ready to fight back with everything at his disposal. Colonel, I need you to contact Lord Ashford, Dr. Hammond, and Dame Elizabeth. Tell them we're implementing the emergency protocols we discussed, and ask them to mobilize their resources immediately. Also, send discreet messages to the parliamentary allies we've cultivated. They need to be prepared for whatever public crisis might emerge from tonight's events. As Colonel Weatherby prepared to carry out his orders, Alexander reflected on how completely the situation had changed from the personal vendetta he had initially perceived in Vivian's actions. What had begun as a stepmother's scheme to secure her position had revealed itself to be part of a much larger threat to Valdorian sovereignty and stability. The young prince who had once worried about festival assignments and social protocols was now commanding a counterintelligence operation to protect his kingdom from foreign infiltration and domestic collaboration. The stakes had escalated far beyond personal succession rights to encompass the very survival of the political system his family had spent generations building. As the night progressed, and reports came in from throughout the palace and beyond, Alexander began to understand that the next few hours would determine not just his own fate or his father's life, but the future direction of Valdorian history. The hidden war that Vivian had been fighting was finally coming into the open, and Alexander intended to ensure that when dawn broke, it would be his enemies who found themselves defeated and exposed. The final phase of the prince's education in the realities of power was about to begin, and this time there would be no room for half measures or political subtlety. The survival of the kingdom itself hung in the balance.